Hello and welcome to the 59th episode of Superhero Ethics. My name is Matthew, I'm one of your hosts.
Hello, I'm Jacob. I'm also one of your hosts.
And today we've got a podcast that I think we're pretty excited to talk about, but I think it's important we start, we're going to be talking about Luke Cage and diving into some great things about that. But I also want to name that this is kind of a sad day. We're recording this today on November 12th, which is, as probably most of you know, the day that Stan Lee passed away. Stan Lee, the founder of Marvel Comics and man who was, really essential to really the creation of so many of the stories that we talk about and that are such a big part of what we do here on the Superhero Ethics podcast. So I wanted to start just by taking a moment to kind of remember him, remember the great things he did. Jacob, for you, what is Stan Lee's legacy? Like, why do you think he's important to kind of the stuff we're talking about today?
Well, one of the big things that Stanley was involved with was actually helping change the standards of the Comics Code Authority. This is
Yeah.
something I actually just found out about today, so I'd love to say that I knew this ahead of time and I was super into comics, but really there's a lot of things, a lot of standards that were put into here that they had to adhere to, and it was sort of their way. The Comics Code Authority was the way for comics to sort of not be regulated by the government, but rather be regulated by something else within the industry. And there's some item, like a lot of the items in there still make sense and are still adhered to this day. Um, but Stan Lee did a lot of stuff that was criticized for defying the code, and then as things went on, helped to sort of get things changed to become a little bit more modern. He's also, of course, heavily involved in co-creating characters like the X-Men, who we
Yep.
talk about at length on this show as good examples of heroes that are really like the X-Men are very much social commentary on our society as a whole, right, and how he would treat superhuman people. And it's the X-Men was actually like my first real introduction to superheroes outside of the Christopher Reeve Superman
Yeah.
movies, and it was just seeing a world where these powered individuals who want to do good are being fought against by the very people they're trying to help was that was a completely different world for me.
Yeah, I think that really sums it up well. I should say also to cut off those people who are already halfway through angry emails. I misspoke a second ago. Stan Lee was not necessarily the founder of Marvel Comics, but he was the editor in chief and the publisher, and was really responsible for creating a lot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we know today. So that's a better way of saying it. And I think you really captured it, Jacob. Stan Lee, he was what we talk about all the time is this idea that characters in not that comic books are the quintessential or the only way to get superheroes, but they certainly have defined the format, the genre quite a bit. And Stan Lee really was pushing this idea that comic books didn't just have to be for kids; they could be social commentary. And I'm by no means an expert on the history of comics, but my understanding is, as we've talked about before, originally Superman kind of started in the same way. He was kind of social commentary. Captain America was a little bit social commentary about the Nazis and all that. But then in the 50s and the 40s and the 50s, comics became much more about being wholesome and American, and that board of comic book standards that you were just talking about, and became kind of something that was looked down on and thought of as just they were fun stories for kids. And Stan Lee really helped to change that. He really helped to bring that back. And really helped to give birth to the comic book world that we know today, and that raises so many of the ethical questions that we raise today. So I think it's just really important, especially on a podcast like this, that owes so much to his memory, owes so much to the work he did, that we just take a moment to remember him, to memorialize him, and to be grateful for the incredible work he did. And so with that, let's kind of shift into what our main topic for today is going to be, which is Luke Cage Season 2. And because, Jacob, you and I have both now seen the show, and we had a lot of thoughts on it. And I want to jump into that, but I want to start with one other kind of disclaimer thought, which is, obviously Luke Cage, with Season 1 and 2, they're about a number of issues, but one of the most important issues that they're really tackling is race. And all of the issues that come up around being a black person, a black man in America, and where that falls, especially in terms of issues of violence and of police violence and of racism and just all the things that comes up. We didn't do an episode on Luke Cage, and that was intentional because I looked at that show and I loved that show, and we've certainly commented on that show. But more than anything, I came away thinking this show is not one that needs two white guys talking about it, because they're just so much of what it was about in terms of race and the like were things that, frankly, I didn't feel, and I think Paul, who was a co-host at the time, neither one of us felt like we were, qualified to have that conversation. And so certainly as we start this episode, I think that we've intentionally looked at our outline and said there's a lot of issues beyond just the questions of race that we're going to be talking about. And that we're to some extent going to leave the issues of racism and things like that Luke Cage brings up. We're not really going to dive into those too much because I think to do that without having a person of color on with just my perspective and Jacob's, as woke as we like to think we are, I think would be disingenuous to the topic. So certainly I would say that there are a number of fantastic podcasters and writers of color who have done a lot of great work on Luke Cage already and are continuing to do great work. And while I hope that you all, our listeners, enjoy what we have to say, I would also definitely say, please, when you finish this podcast, take a moment to check out some of those other writers, some of those other podcasters, because while I think we'll have some interesting things to say, at the end of the day, two white guys are not going to have the definitive word about Luke Cage.
I mean, that was a very very large number of words to say exactly that, but I feel
Yeah.
like it was also very eloquently put. And I agree. I would love to be in a world where I can sit here and pretend that I can talk about the race issues that Luke Cage deals with a level of clarity and a level of knowledge that somebody who has experienced these things would also have. It's just not possible. My experience is so radically different, and there's no. I wouldn't feel right. I'd feel like I was either just saying things based off of what I saw in media, which is a really bad thing to do. Fictional stories
Yep.
are fictional, right? They're not real. Or worse yet, just sort of assume from a position of ignorance, which usually gets somebody into a lot of trouble. So it's better. I think it's better that we don't. It's not like we're unwilling to talk about these topics. I think they're very important topics in our society to this day. But when we're talking about the analysis of Luke Cage and our viewpoints on the different ethical considerations that season 2 specifically brings, we want to focus on things that we feel we can speak with. Perhaps not authority, as we've said, neither of us are experts, but at least we have some idea what we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's well put. And so with that, let's start to jump in. So just first of all, starting with general impressions, what was your take on Luke Cage season 2?
Well, and I think you and I have had this conversation. I liked it. I liked it better than I liked season 1. Now, part of that is because I liked the first half of season 1, and I didn't dislike the second half, but I didn't like, and I think we've talked about this before, I didn't like Diamondback as a major antagonist. I thought Mariah Dillard was a far more interesting antagonist. And hey, look, Luke Cage season 2 came along, and we're like, oh,
Yeah.
you wanted Mariah Dillard to be an antagonist. Here you go. And suddenly I was in.
Yeah, I'm in the same way. I thought Luke Cage season 1 is some of the best television I've ever seen, but like a lot of Netflix shows, it faltered in the second half. It had a little bit of bloat. It did not have a great. Diamondback was just such a letdown after Cottonmouth. And while I didn't think that Luke Cage 2 ever hit the really high highs of Luke Cage season 1, overall I thought it was just a stronger show because it did not have that sort of like end of season bloat. Mariah and Bushmaster were both fantastic villains the whole way through. And I really thought it just raised so many interesting questions that we're going to get into, especially about what does it mean to be, trying to be the hero in a difficult world. In that I feel like if the central story of season 1 is Luke reluctantly deciding to be a hero, the story of season 2, I think, is him realizing maybe a hero isn't what Harlem needs. And I'm forever haunted by that line from Mariah Dillard towards the end of where she asks him, does does Harlem need a hero or does it need a king? And as we'll get into, I think that's what watching Luke explore that question was, I think, just such a fascinating part of this series.
And again why I feel like season two is just overall better because Luke Cage, where Luke Cage excelled both times as a story, is when the central conflict that Luke is wrestling with, is not a his past, which is interesting, right? I'm not saying that that isn't interesting, but when he's dealing with the circumstances around himself, when his struggles are social in nature, right, and they're bigger than him and they're bigger than individual people, that's when it's interesting because we know he can't just solve that problem by going around and busting heads.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you and I have talked a number of times about the flaw of the superhero model in that it because these shows always lead to great fight scenes, they sort of indicate the idea that you can fix problems by fighting. And one thing I really liked was seeing this season explore Luke's frustration and how at times that turned into anger and not really healthy anger at the idea that he really can't just solve everything by being bulletproof and by being super strong.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so let's talk about some of the specifics. And I know one thing we mentioned was that one of the other major themes in this show was revenge. And there's a number of kind of intersecting plot lines where people are trying to get revenge on each other in this show. What's your kind of take on what this show has to say about vengeance and revenge as plot as character motivators?
Well, apparently, what the show has to say about revenge is that uh, almost everybody who gets to a certain position of power wants it over somebody in some fashion, or like apparently, whenever you connect with somebody in a way, uh, I guess whenever you're hurt, uh, the desire to seek revenge just seems to be something that is universal and overwhelming, and we see it in a lot of the characters in the show, not just in Bushmaster, wanting to go against every Stokes that is still breathing, but in Tilda, right, in Mariah's daughter, um, Mariah, who actually a lot of her motivation, a lot of what she was struggling with in season one even was because she was sort of she was still wrestling with what happened with her uncle Pete, right? And so just this constant cycle. So I feel like what the show is saying is like when you enter this cycle of pain and hurt, you end up with people wanting to seek revenge because that perpetuates the cycle,
Yeah.
which is sort of it's good writing. It's also pretty realistic.
hmm Especially because when you talk about the cycle, to me, like Tilda with her mother, like that is clearly it's about two people who had this relationship with each other. Um, Mariah Dillard, her mother Mabel was deeply involved in the murder of Bushmaster's parents and everything that happened to his family. But Mariah was just a young girl at the time that it happened, and to me, I always think one of the ways in which I think revenge storylines really cross a line. Not that they become bad stories, but where it really now is about vengeance going much deeper. Is when now this is about your parents did something terrible to my parents, and so I have to do something terrible to you.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a Hatfields and McCoys kind of situation.
right, right. Because I mean, that just becomes the cycle that continues on forever. But also, what does it mean that we're doing where we are literally, holding the children accountable for the sins of the parents? Um, and I think that was in some ways, to me, it made me feel not necessarily sympathy for Mariah, but really felt like she was such a tragic character in this show because so much of her story has been trying to prove that she is not Mabel, that she will not do the things Mabel did, that she will not be as bad as Mabel was, that she will be better in ways Mabel was not. And that she recognizes that she is becoming more and more like Mabel and she hates it and she's fighting it. And then at the same time, here comes this other person who is blaming her for the things Mabel did. And that
Hmm.
him attacking her for the things Mabel did is making her fight back in ways that are making her like Mabel. I mean that's Greek tragedy level of of cycle, in a way that I just thought was such a powerful part of the story.
Yeah, up to and including the more Bushmaster aggresses against her, the more the further down the pit she ends up going, right?
Right,
We enter this story and Mariah is, and I would even argue laudably, trying to get out of the criminal life. She's trying to go legitimate so that she can cut ties with criminal organizations. And part of that is, to be able to preserve her political career. But I do actually feel that there's genuinely a part of her that wants to just, now that she's established herself in this position of power, actually use that power to do some good. And
yeah.
she's denied it at every turn by this ghost from her past, from her mother's past, really. Um, and it's just sort of, it's funny because for Mariah, Bushmaster ends up being like this physical manifestation of everything that Mariah wants to not be that her mother was,
Right.
and he's sort of the ghost that she can't get rid of.
Yeah, and so it becomes, therefore, I think, so ironic that probably the single most brutal, act of violence that happens in this season, the burning of Anasazi, which I'm sure I pronounced horribly wrong, is not
Anansi,
done.
right?
Anas, thank you, is not done by Bushmaster. It's done by Mariah. And to me, that's the moment where, um, I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's coincidental that, Mabel's final act against the family in Jamaica is to burn their home and
Mm-hmm.
to use fire to kill them. And now Mariah is using fire again against that same family.
Yep.
To me, that was very much, this is the moment where Mariah has really can no longer claim in any way that she's any better than Mabel.
Yeah, and it's as you said, it's tragic in a way because I mean, and I'm not saying that Mariah's behavior at that point is excusable in any way. That was the most horrific scene I have seen in any, like, I think that one actually trumps the decapitating somebody with a car door from Kingpin, because at least that was a quick death.
Right.
Mariah clearly wanted Anansi to suffer because she was trying to send a message. Uh, and that message was received, but like, well, obviously she did not comprehend that she wasn't going to be able to make somebody quit out of just being like, nope, that's too far. Now I'm yeah. I think that was like possibly her goal, was to try to get rid of the conflict by doing something so monstrous that nobody would want to interact with her again. But
In some ways, I think she's learning the same things that Luke is learning, though obviously she's learning it from a much more horrific perspective. But it's that at the end of the day, no matter how brutal your violence is, that won't necessarily solve the problem.
yep, because really it's funny because actually the more brutal you get, the stronger that desire for revenge in the people you've wronged seems to become. Um, because that, it sort of confirms their righteousness, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that Bushmaster actually feels as though his cause for revenge is in some ways a just one.
Right.
And it's only reinforced, that idea is reinforced by Mariah doing this incredibly horrific thing, to Anansi, actually, like, obviously going into the restaurant and murdering a bunch of people, also not okay, right? It's just that particular moment that I think you're highlighting that really crosses the line from, this is, two people who are fighting each other and who are both engaging in very violent ways, trying to best the other, and turns it into something about, no, now I'm trying to just hurt you.
Yeah. No, I definitely get that. And I realized you watched it more recently than I did. I rewatched the last three episodes just last night, but most of it I watched when it came out, which was a couple months ago. Because I think as much as he is fighting for revenge against her for things that her mother did, Mabel did, but I do remember that part of the issue was that the feeling that Bushmaster's family had a real ownership claim to Harlem's paradise,
Hmm.
and I think, while to some extent this is obviously like the sins of Mabel being visited on Mariah, there is an extent to which he goes to Mariah to try to like work that out, and she rejects him. So there is at least to some extent which she takes that on as much as it's not just her being unfairly blamed.
Right. Bushmaster comes in to talk with her at one point in Harlem's Paradise, but basically he wants to stake a claim to Harlem's Paradise, and she's
Right.
not willing to entertain the notion
Yeah.
that the Stokes and that Buggy Stokes and I'm trying to remember the name of the Bushmaster character that Buggy was in partnership with. They made apparently very delicious rum that I'd love to get my hands on, because if
Yes.
you can make a clear rum that tastes as good as those people's expressions made me think it tasted, I want some.
Yeah. No, I definitely hear that. Well, and let's just hit one other point of revenge, which is Tilda. Um,
Hmm.
what what was your take on Tilda's? Because she kind of takes two very distinctly different but really powerful acts of revenge. I guess revenge against her mother, or certainly like trying to get even with her mother. One of which is helping Bushmaster to take her on, and then is at the end outright killing her mother.
Hmm.
What's your take on Tilda's storyline there?
Well, she doesn't go to the point of outright killing her mother until after her mother chooses a very tense, very fearful moment for all of them to reveal Tilda's actual origin,
Right,
um, and does it in a way where where Mariah is clearly trying to tell Tilda that she doesn't love her at all, right?
right.
Their relationship is obviously quite complicated, both because Mariah is sometimes not having the best grasp of reality and sanity. Uh, as the season goes on, she gets literally haunted by Mabel Stokes at one point,
Mm-hmm.
which I pretty sure that's in fiction supposed to be her envisioning Mabel there, not a literal actual ghost. But this is Marvel, so it could actually be a literal actual ghost. So I don't know either way there.
Anything
Um,
goes.
yep. But uh, so in that particular moment, she's clearly pushing Tilda away very hard, and this is after Tilda has made a conscious effort to try to reconnect with her mother, to try to
Right,
reconnect with Mariah. So I feel like I understand her motivation, where she's just appalled at what Mariah has become, and I think but I think once it gets to the point of the very end of the season. So I think helping Bushmaster is because she thinks Bushmaster has a point, right? And
yeah,
that her mother needs a check. Um, I think when we get to the point of Tilda assassinating Mariah, right through the poison in the lipstick, right? That was how that scene went down.
yep,
Yes. I think that particular moment was less about Tilda deciding that she was going to exact her revenge on her mother, and more about her fearing that her mother continuing to exist in this world was an evil that she couldn't permit. Right?
right,
I actually feel like there she just made a sort of more clinical decision, that treating her mother as if her mother was some kind of disease on Harlem. Um, at least that's how I took it from how the narrative was presented to me. I'm not saying I agree with Tilda's assessment in that situation, but I
right.
feel like once we got to that point, um, she was sort of not really emotionally invested in the outcome so much as certain
Yeah.
that it was right.
I think it's interesting, and I think it bears noting, and I surely did not know this when watching it, but there seems to be a lot of well, in the comics, Tilda Johnson is a supervillain known as Nightshade or Doctor Nightshade or Deadly
Hmm.
Nightshade,
Hmm.
um, and who among other things is kind of this expert chemist and who kills through things like poison lipstick and the like, and I think that scene was very much like going back and knowing that. I think that scene was very much supposed to establish this is the moment when she becomes Nightshade. This is the moment when she becomes, the next villain, or at least one of the next villains Luke Cage is going to have to deal with. That's if we get another season, and that's another story. Um, but And so if that is the case, we've talked before about how often supervillains or villains are ones who are kind of confused about their own motivations and can convince themselves that there's like a higher reason or that they're being like logical when really to some extent they're acting on their own emotion. And and I think that's kind of what I saw here because I think you're right. I think Tilda believes that she is doing this because she has logically deduced that Mariah has to die and that Mariah is bad for Harlem and bad for the world. And certainly there's all sorts of reasons to think that that's correct. I also don't think that just this lifetime of hurt and pain from Mariah, um, which has now become so crystallized, as you said, in that moment where Mariah is just incredibly cruel to her and says, she could never love her because she reminds her of all these terrible things. I, I wonder to what extent this is Tilda just wanting her dead because of how much that hurt and how horrible that was, and then finding a way to justify it. Because to me, that's if you want to kick someone off into becoming a master criminal like Nightshade, that's certainly one hell of an origin story.
It's also honestly more of a gray strokes brush in this particular villain's origin story, if that's what they're doing, which I like.
Yeah.
Um, I like the nuance. By the end of the season, it was funny is because I was always treating Mariah as a character that had that same kind of, well, I can see where she's coming from. I can see that she has some noble goals, and her means are pretty questionable. Um, but again, and I keep coming back to the restaurant, but that was a huge turn in her character for me.
Yeah.
And it went from me going, oh, she's very similar to Kingpin in that I don't agree with her methods, but some of what she's trying to do, like some of the goals, the abstract goals, not the, you know, not the gentrification that Kingpin was trying to do, but the abstract idea of making Hell's Kitchen better, or Mariah's goal of trying to help Harlem, um, was good.
Yeah.
But but then that happened and I could no longer side with her, right? I could no longer give her that angle, which is funny because I really probably should feel the same way about Kingpin and I don't know why.
That's
I don't
fair.
know what that says about me as a person. I hope nothing bad. Uh, I just think that a quick death is better than burning somebody to death. Although she does shoot him in the head.
I was going to
But
say, on the one hand, I don't remember that being a very quick death, the car door capitation. But also, I think, and to me, it's an interesting moment because I think, to some extent, one of the people who are freaked out by Mariah being willing to do this
mhm.
is Mariah. And as you said,
Yep.
she has that moment where she burns him, she wants him to suffer, and then she just says, "Just die already," and shoots him herself.
Yep.
Um, and I don't think she's having a moment of mercy and wanting to help him as much as she's having a moment of she just can't stomach watching this man burn to death, even though she
hmm
did it.
hmm
And some would say that's a moment of weakness from her. Some would say that's a moment of she still has more of her humanity than others do. But either way, I think it's a very telling moment for her character.
Yeah. Now we haven't talked. So we could probably spend an entire podcast actually just dissecting the character of Mariah Dillard. We haven't
Hmm.
talked much about Bushmaster. We've mentioned a little bit about his particular revenge arc and how he goes about executing it, but I wanted to know what you thought about his quest, specifically the things that he does to himself and to others in order to try to exact this revenge.
I really liked it. And again, this is one of the things I liked most. And again, I don't want to dive too into it, but I just want to make note of it. Is for me, growing up in New York City, I was very well aware that there were the black population of New York City is by no means homogenous, and there's many different divisions, and one of them is between what you might call African American or black, but with Caribbean American, and that the Caribbean American populations I knew were very adamant about not being thought of in the same regard. And again, I'm making gross generalizations here. This is just my anecdotal experience. But the point being that I know that I was really interested in seeing that be explored, and seeing the tensions in those communities be touched on and explored. Um, and I thought they for the most part did a very good job of doing that. I have read a lot of commentary that Bushmaster's accent was actually quite bad and was not very representative of what a Jamaican accent should have sounded like. It's not something I can comment on, but I certainly trust that perspective. But I did enjoy that part of the character. Um, and I thought overall he was. It's funny because on the surface, I'm so mad at your family that I'm going to poison myself with something that's going to destroy me long term, but give me super strength now to fight you. Feels like almost a bad cliche. And yet I thought this story carried it off really well. They made him a incredibly believable character. They made me feel like this was a person who was brutal and sociopathic very much because of his circumstances, and that doesn't excuse him, but it makes you sympathetic for how he became who he was in a way that I found really powerful and relatable. Um, and then in some ways, I feel like, especially because we got so much of Luke and his father this season, I felt like to some extent they were also saying like Bushmaster is what Luke could have become if he didn't have, granted Luke had such a troubled family life for himself, but Luke gains his powers as an adult after so much else has formed him as who he was. Um, Bushmaster didn't. Bushmaster, had first had this the his life saved by the mystical chemical or whatever it is um that saves him. That happens to him when he's very young, and then he loses his parents when he's very young. This idea of revenge gets started when he's very young. Um, this is all a way of saying I really like the character because it felt like a cliche, but didn't become that. It became so much richer than that.
Yeah, and I really I want to say so I agree. Bushmaster was I came into Luke Cage season 2, and when I started watching, I was like, okay, great, this is going to be the season where I get Mariah as a major villain, and Bushmaster came on the scene, and it was like a couple of episodes in, and I was all like, oh, so we have two really interesting characters that are antagonists to Luke Cage, and in particular, I feel like what's interesting is because Bushmaster's quest for revenge is against Mariah, who is obviously set up as another villain for the season. But I find his most interesting interactions are with Luke. In particular, like when the two conflict, they obviously both don't think Mariah should have the power that she has. They
Hmm.
have different ways of going about it, and there's even a moment where they team up, right? Um, for a brief period of time,
Yeah.
and it's because and they so they have some shared ideology and some shared values, and they're able to recognize that. I just I thought that entire storyline was very powerful, and for Bushmaster's perspective, very tragic, because
Hmm.
I do think that he's very much a product of the circumstances around his early childhood, and like you know it's hard to say that he's entirely to blame for his sort of singular direction, given that what else did he have after that? Is his parents were taken away from him? Uh, they tried to take his life away, right? Uh,
Hmm.
and he survived it, and like then I think his quest for revenge against Mariah gives him purpose that he doesn't have otherwise.
Yeah. No, and I think that's true, and I think that's and to some extent, that's maybe the biggest contrast between him and Luke Cage is that he is primarily fighting against something. He is fighting against the Dillards, the Stokeses, whereas Luke Cage is fighting for something. Luke wants to defend and protect Harlem. Um, and that's actually probably a good moment to transition. And we could talk again. Any of these topics could be a full episode, but in many ways, I think the most certainly I think the most debated and the most not the most interesting, but certainly one of the most interesting and one of the most sort of raising questions, plot arcs is Luke's himself, and where he ends up. And so let's discuss King Luke. And just start by um, when we first meet Luke, the thing he's really dealing with is anger, and his kind of almost inability to control his anger. What was your take on that, especially in how it played out with Claire?
Hmm. So, I'll be honest. The especially the scene in Claire's apartment, where Luke Cage punches a wall. That was a very emotional scene for me.
Hmm.
I've been in that room,
Yeah.
if as it were. And so for me, seeing the emotion on Claire's face in that scene, seeing that Luke was driven to a point that he felt that he had to do that to control the conversation was just so, like, I felt like a hero that I had come to respect and admire had fallen just immediately in that moment. I mean, it did show me that this is the level of anger management problem that Luke is dealing with right now, but it had already reached an untenable level, right?
Right.
And I mean, I like that the show names it. I like that the show highlights that, gives us that scene, and then gives us the fallout. I kind of wish they had done a little bit more to have him work his own stuff out. We had the episode where Danny Rand came on, which is again very odd for me to be saying this, but like it was really really good Danny Rand.
I know, right? That was
Yeah,
so weird.
no, it was great because he was all like, "No, you need to find your center. You're going around being an angry jerk, and you'd be better if you weren't." Um, and like he wasn't obnoxious somehow, and like I was, so yeah, so but I wanted a little bit more of that only because I feel like as much as it was dealt with, I don't feel like the fact that it was a huge problem was dealt with enough.
Hmm.
Um, I really feel like there should have been more. Winnowing's the wrong term. I feel like Luke should have struggled a lot more. At one point, gotten really sad about how much he had lost control. Things like that. I would have wanted to see that particular struggle. That being said, he's he's presented a character in Bushmaster who is also sort of ruled by anger, but it's this sort of directed, focused anger now, right?
Right.
And so it's funny because as you mentioned earlier, there's almost a mirror being held up between the two of them, which obviously is intentional. The people who wrote the show know what they're doing, but it's funny to me that it takes Luke a very long time to realize, sort of there, but the grace of whomever go I when
Hmm.
dealing with Bushmaster.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially in terms of, to me, I always think like, just giving into anger, like for me, this all comes back to Star Wars, and all the stuff about like giving into anger and letting anger rule you is the path to the dark side. I mean, that's been I would say that's been my defining idea for such a long time, but certainly in more recent years, I've become a lot more comfortable with the idea of anger as a motivating force. But when it's controlled and when you're aware of it, and in that regard, almost on this one issue, not on most of them, but on this one issue, I more think Bushmaster has the right idea because Bushmaster acknowledges his anger and is willing to live into it, whereas Luke Cage is trying so hard to suppress his anger that it winds up coming out in ways he can't control, like when he's just so frustrated and, as you said, expresses it with Claire. Um, and I think the show actually, I would disagree a bit. I think the show did in subtle ways, but I think the show did, you know, show how frustrated he was and how sad he was about how that had all happened, and that a lot of his desperately really trying to find a way to solve the Mariah issue and the saving Harlem issue had a lot more to do with him feeling like he had failed in other areas. Um, but I think you're right that the way that they play, Luke against Bushmaster in that is really powerful.
And and I do like it does sort of fit with Luke's arc in this season, as you mentioned earlier, which is a great point, and I wanted to bring it up again because it's really the big question for Luke. He starts the season sort of as he's the hero of Harlem, and people are throwing that around, that title around, and there's this app that you can follow him around with, and he like somebody catches him, doing laying down his unique brand of justice, and he says some stuff
Mhm.
and dabs like he's trying to
Yeah.
get into this sort of hero persona, um, and like he kind you can tell he hates how fake some of it is. that
Yeah.
like he's doing it to like the public persona thing and what it takes to be uh, a hero and a figure that people look up to and respect involves sometimes sort of being dishonest, which I don't think he likes.
Yeah.
Um, and as the season progresses, his a lot of his anger, a lot of his frustration is that he's not able to deal with the problems in Harlem, the social problems in Harlem, the with as a hero, right? He can't do it just by going and knocking heads or trying to encourage people to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough. He needs another way. The way that he finds, God, I really want there to be a Luke Cage season three.
Yeah.
Um,
I have thoughts on that, which we'll get to, but I definitely hear you on that. And I think you're right. I think, to me, so much of Luke's arc this season is about him trying to have control and him being frustrated when he can't. He can't control what's happening with his image and how people see him, even though he tries. He can't control how other people think of him. He can't control what's happening, what the police are going to do or what the politicians or the courts are going to do. He can't control other people in Harlem. And on some level, he can't control himself.
mhm.
And so what I think we've kind of hinted at it, but to me the granddaddy question of this is what Luke Cage decides to do at the end. And I I think we've been assuming this whole time that most of our listeners have watched all of Luke Cage season two. I'm going to make sure we didn't. There will be a spoiler warning at the start of this to make sure people know. You probably want to watch Luke Cage season two, but just in case anyone who hasn't seen it and is listening to this, or who just doesn't remember it well because it's been a couple months, can you briefly summarize sort of what's the big decision he makes at the end of season two of Luke Cage?
Yeah, it's funny because what ends up happening is Luke is effectively offered Harlem's Paradise, right?
Yeah,
And like if you don't know the storyline, the significance of that is that this is a place that has been run by the major organized criminal element in Harlem for a long time now, right? Cottonmouth had it when Luke came to Harlem, and then it was Mariah who was controlling Harlem's Paradise, and for a time Bushmaster in this season controls it, and it's sort of this position of power, but it's the kind of power that isn't, it isn't our hero power. This isn't like his Fortress of Solitude.
right,
This is a place where the underworld comes to do business, right? And rather than, I think Luke Cage from season one would have flat out rejected the offer, been all like, "I'm above that. That's not me."
right.
Luke Cage in this season goes, "You know what? No, my way isn't working. I'm going to
Yeah.
take this," and he becomes the owner and lord of Harlem's Paradise.
And to me, in some ways, like, I mean, he does that, and even before that, when he basically, he takes Mariah Stokes or Dillard, however you describe her, he takes Mariah's comment of, you know, Harlem doesn't need a hero, it needs a king, and he becomes that.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most powerful scenes to me are, first of all, we learn that sort of without Mariah, that the idea is that Mariah had sort of built this wall around Harlem, and that with her in jail, there's now all of this, crime that's happening again, and that someone needs to step up and fill that vacuum. And we see at the very end of not even the second to last episode, and the last episode, him going to the other criminal bosses in town and sort of letting them know he is now going to take over. Um, and I'm sure you caught this. I don't know if all of our listeners did. To me, one of the best scenes is there's a moment in Harlem's Paradise towards the very end where Misty is sort of watching him as the people who are like serving him in this role as the head of Harlem's Paradise and the head of Harlem are sort of paying tribute to him, and the door slowly closes on her watching. And have you seen the first Godfather movie?
Mm-mm.
Okay, that is very distinctly that exact scene happens in the Godfather movie, and it's the moment when Michael Corleone's wife realizes that he is becoming the crime boss, and that she will like that he's sort of choosing that life. And to me, that moment was incredible. I thought it was brilliant filmmaking or TV making, and it was a very intentional way of him showing that he's becoming this. Because in The Godfather, that's one of the primary ideas of that story is that you have these neighborhoods where the police aren't doing their job, and so people like the Italian mafia have to kind of become the rulers of the neighborhood, and that they do a lot of crime, that they profit, and they're very corrupt, but they also keep their neighborhood safe when the police
Hmm.
won't do the job. And I think the story here that they're trying to tell is, can Luke do the I'm going to protect the neighborhood that the cops aren't serving without becoming corrupted and without becoming just one more criminal? And I
Technically
don't know if he
speaking,
can.
he already is a criminal, right?
Well,
Um,
sure, but
in insofar as he's definitely guilty of assault and battery on many, many, many
but
counts.
but more what I meant was, I mean, obviously there's that, but what I meant was is that the story that I think happens so often, and certainly happened with Mariah, is that in claiming all the power to protect the neighborhood, you wind up having the power to enrich yourself. And then over time, your desire to enrich yourself and to protect yourself becomes more and more of your motivation instead of just helping others.
Yeah,
Um,
power corrupts absolute. Power corrupts absolutely. Right.
yeah.
That whole adage, which is interesting because we leave Luke in that moment where he's sort of established his power base, right? And it already like he looks different, right? He's
Yeah.
holding himself different, and so I think the season ends with sort of a cliffhanger in a way, in that the question is open, and in particularly I'm thinking the question is open because of how in the least ethical decision Luke Cage has ever made, how he dealt with Mariah's death, or
Mm.
rather Mariah's final moments. Um, so in that, I mean, I feel like that's his first slip in a way from where he was before, from the I am the hero with the higher ideal, and I'm always going to do the right thing, to sort of again like sort of that Tilda the thing that I ascribed to Tilda's thinking earlier about, well, because he lets Mariah die in his arms. He
Hmm.
could have called for help. He chose not to. Um, like, and it was a conscious choice. Pretty sure he names it in that scene, if I'm not mistaken.
He
Um,
he does. I think the idea is also supposed to be that she's probably beyond saving, but he's certainly, she had manipulated him. I think a number of times until then, she had kind of taken advantage of that and manipulated him into helping her. And I guess I saw that as him breaking with that. But you're right; it is a little ethically questionable because if he could have saved her, then maybe what does that say that he doesn't?
well, and I mean, if you look at the interactions between Mariah and Luke throughout the season, she's been goading him slash training him into this role.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it, so like in a way, it was sort of the student becomes the master moment, which is really horrifying given how far down the hole we saw Mariah go. Um, to think of a character like Luke going from somebody who was, a well-meaning person trying to do the right thing, into becoming like Mariah or like Mabel before her, right? But it did really seem to me like uh, this is kind of what Mariah wanted, and so
Hmm.
in a way, even though she dies, I feel like she won.
I think on some level that's true. I think certainly, I think especially her dying at the hands of Tilda, I think her own daughter, I think sort of erases any joy she might have in that moment. Um, but I do think that that's because I think the question we're sort of hinting at but haven't quite addressed straight on is Luke right to make this decision? And I'm honestly not sure he is, and I kind of think he might be. But certainly the fact that it's what Mariah is pushing him into makes it by itself. That makes me even more like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do.
I feel like it's funny. It's a similar decision to what so Batman Begins. I'm gonna talk about Batman Begins. End of Batman Begins with Ra's al Ghul. is exactly the same thing, right? Where basically all the hero has to do is not act, and the villain dies,
Right.
right? And the question is it right for is it ethically correct for a hero to do that, or does that sort of revoke their hero privileges? Can you no longer be somebody that we call a champion of justice and good and what is right if you through intentional inaction allow somebody to perish that you could have
Right.
probably potentially could have saved? Like maybe she was beyond saving. I feel like that was very much left ambiguous. Um and I feel like Luke didn't know either way and didn't care.
I think I guess I have a couple of thoughts here. First of all, I think the scene with Batman Begins bothers me much more because for Batman, it is much more established as a just fundamental character trait that he saves people. That he not only doesn't kill people, but that he pulls Joker back from the edge of the cliff. Which even I thought in the Dark Knight they got that right at least. That sounds like I didn't like Dark Knight. I think Dark Knight was fantastic, but I'm saying like there I feel like they corrected it even for Batman Begins because in Batman Begins, that moment just feels not only like it's ethically wrong for Batman to do, but I just didn't believe it. I don't believe Batman would do that. Um, with Luke, it's interesting. I've now watched that scene twice. I didn't get the sense that he was letting her die because I got the sense that he was just more kind of like. So I guess I didn't think about it in those terms as much as you have. Um, but you're right. In those terms, that's a choice that he makes, and that's probably an important part of him maybe saying he's not going to be a hero anymore. This idea of not being a hero but being a king. Um, honestly, yeah, it's a hard one, and it troubles me that Luke makes these choices, and I don't agree with him making those choices. But I think they're very believable, and I understand why the character is making those choices.
Hmm. And what's interesting, I think, as well, is Luke ends up making peace with his father this season, which is some very, very touching scenes, actually, in my opinion, were between Luke and Luke's dad, whose name escapes me. Um, it's Lucas. His last name is Lucas,
Yep.
because it's Carl Lucas and Reverend whatever.
Yeah.
I'll look it up and chide myself later. But the main thing is James. Must be
James. That's it.
James.
Yep.
Yeah. Um. So the main thing is that all of uh James's counsel, all of the Reverend's counsel to Luke is about the righteous path, right? And talking about what's right for Luke to do and like how he can make those decisions and what sort of what direction he should take his life in.
Right.
And sort of you're the master of your own destiny and things like that. And Luke's father, like, so they make amends, they sort of patch up, and then Luke's father leaves. And ultimately, what Luke decides to do is to sort of walk a different path entirely, right?
Hmm.
And I feel like that again, that finale scene where he's in the suit and he's talking, he's getting people whispering in his ear and then closing a door. That whole setup, I wasn't aware of the significance to other theatrical properties from earlier uh, in
Hmm.
our history, but that scene really bothered me because it really felt like what the story was trying to tell me was that Luke has made the decision to embrace this role, this position of power, and sort of fix the underworld, like do the good that he can, from within that
Right.
system, which I really wish you have seen Angel, because I would
Mm.
love to talk about Angel season 5 in the context of this, and I feel like I can't because you're missing way too much of the context. It would just be me talking, um, for
Well,
the benefit of some of the people listening.
and I get that because frankly, a lot of where I think they're going to go with the Luke Cage story, I can't talk about it because I know you haven't seen the last Iron Fist season yet, um, which I'm amazed to say is really good. Which
I'm a
we,
couple
we
episodes in, and I agree.
okay,
I'm
cool.
shocked, but yeah, some
Well,
of the stuff they're doing with Joy, like it, there's going to be a lot to talk about
yeah.
there too.
And I'll use this as a moment to just do a quick aside because I know one of the elephants in the room is we've talked about what happens next with Luke Cage. Luke Cage, the show has been canceled.
Hmm.
Um, what I think is going to happen, and I hope is going to happen, and I'm going to try and make sure I say this without spoiling anything, but this is a little bit like getting into what happens in Iron Fist. I think that we're not going to have Iron Fist or Luke Cage as shows anymore, but instead we're going to have Heroes for Hire and Daughters of the Dragon,
Hmm.
um, which to me would be amazing as well. But part of what I hope for that is because, as you said, Danny and Luke actually had a really great interaction. And I think when I look at sort of the cliff that Luke has walked himself out onto, I think what pulls him back is Danny.
Hmm.
Because I do think that Danny could be like that. That what I would hope for is something where, and maybe even not even Danny, but we get more to the defenders. That it's sort of all of like I mean, gosh, how great would a new season of Defenders be where it starts out that Luke Cage is the big bad?
Oh
Um,
man, I would love that.
and I don't think it's going to happen, but I would love it if some combination of Danny and Daredevil and Jessica and all of them are to some extent like help Luke see why what he's doing is a mistake, um, or at least why it's not going to work. Because again, I don't think he can be a hero and do this, and I want him to be a hero. But on some level, maybe Harlem does need a king more than needs a hero. I'm not 100% sold on that. That's a very pragmatic thing, and that's a very like least of all possible evils thing. But maybe that is what's needed. I'm still not quite there on quite
I
sure
would
on that one
be
yet.
I would be even more into a Defender season where we start off with Luke as the central antagonist, and then about halfway through the season when they have a major confrontation, and there's this reveal that what yeah, Luke's done a lot of very questionable things, and it's because of this other major problem. There's no other way to deal with it, and then they have to start helping him.
Yeah,
Would be, but again, I'm not a writer.
yeah.
The team of writers they have at the doing the Marvel Netflix shows are definitely way competent, and they'll produce something that I enjoy almost certainly, but they haven't done it all the time.
If it's still them, I mean, there's a slight chance that we just get Disney instead of Netflix going forward. But
That's true.
we'll,
Disney is
we'll
doing their own streaming service that is an even larger elephant in the room, and I will not comment on it
um,
beyond naming it.
what do you think of? Let's just get in a one last thing with Luke, and then move on to one or two more things because we're already at the hour point. Um, what do you think of his decision to turn Claire away, to not even engage with Claire when Claire comes to the club to see him?
So I'm very torn on this one because I do feel as though he's put himself into a position. But first of all, I feel like he has not resolved his anger issues, and I think he knows that. And I think that he doesn't like. I think he correctly doesn't trust himself yet to be around people he cares that deeply about for fear of like him losing control again or whatever. I think that might be part of it. But I also really, really, really hate the trope of, oh, I'm gonna protect you from me by pushing you away and denying you the ability to whatever.
Mm,
So I think like there's a narrative where you could frame it to be him trying to keep her out of the muck that he's now had to dip his hands into,
right.
trying to like not trying to distance himself from her so that she's not connected to some of the shady stuff he's now going to have to be. But there's also that like taking Claire's decision about whether or not she wants to be a part of his world in that, even with that, is something that I don't really like. I do
So
feel
I
like.
go
Go
ahead.
on. No, go on.
Uh, I do feel like that is a terrible cliche and one I want nothing to do with. But I actually I like this, and again, it's such a small scene, so maybe I'm headcanoning. But I thought they were intentionally not leaning into that because I thought the reading that I had from it was not them saying he's trying to protect her, but he's trying to protect himself. And specifically, what I mean by that is that he kind of is aware that he is intentionally walking away from the side of him that Claire more than anyone saw. You know,
Hmm.
Claire brought out the hero in him. Claire wanted him to be this incredible hero. And I think it's kind of that he knows that he is, what I took it as is that on some level, he is conflicted about what he's doing, and he's trying very hard to silence the part of his own brain that's saying, Luke, you're supposed to be a hero, you're not supposed to be a king. And that he knows that if Claire is in his life, she's going to be that same voice, and he just can't take that. Um, and again, that might be a whole bunch of headcanon, but certainly that's where I went with it. That it,
I like that take because if you suddenly change it to be Luke protecting his own interest,
mm-hmm,
now I like that narrative better
yeah,
because then it's him making choices for himself rather than him making choices for another person,
mm-hmm,
right? That they don't have any agency or control over. And so, and I know ultimately, at least in the comic series, those two do not end up together in any kind of long term situation.
uh huh,
Um, I'm wondering if they're going to re-explore the Luke Jessica Jones romance, because I think that could have legs again, um, but I feel like maybe it might just be that the writers want to put some distance there to make room, but I hope that Claire's character doesn't go away as a result of
mm-hmm,
this, because if she thinks Matt Murdock is dead, right, and Luke doesn't want her around anymore, uh, she's probably still going to be in the city doing what she does, but
yeah.
a
And
lot of her connections, other than through Colleen and Danny, are gone.
I can't comment on this because I have seen the next two shows, and so I know what her role is
Okay,
or is not in
okay,
those
okay,
shows.
okay.
But I'll just say, yeah, I think you're right. That brings up some interesting stuff. Um, we want to not go too long, and our next area is going to be the Stokes, but I feel like we've kind of touched on most of that. So let's go ahead to what was going to be our last question, which is, I think, a relationship that is not explored much, but what is explored is, I think, really fascinating, and I wish we'd kind of gotten more of, which is the Shades Comanche relationship. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which to me is powerful in a lot of ways. I mean, A, just because it brings up the idea of two men loving each other in a in a situation that is almost never thought to be explored, um, and it gets into the idea of sort of of a prison sexual relationship. Is that supposed to be something that just is in prison, or that translates into something more back in the out of prison world? And that raises so many questions. Um, and then also, of course, the way that it ends with Shades realizing that Comanche, who is not only his lover but it was his best friend from childhood, that Comanche is now working with the cops, and Shades killing him. What was your take on that storyline? Because certainly that was a very powerful one.
So there's a scene. So for a while, I understood their connection to just be that they've been friends since childhood. They've come up together, and there's this very strong connection between them. And there's a scene in Pops in the barber shop where Shades and Comanche are sitting back to back, waiting for Luke Cage to get back there to ambush him. So they're doing a little camp out, and there's this exchange between the two of them that for me was heartbreaking, because you can clearly tell from that scene, I feel, that Comanche possesses very strong romantic feelings still for Shades and doesn't feel like he can express them,
Yeah,
and Shades is trying to, like, he cares very deeply about Comanche. He's like, again, they've had a very close friendship their whole life, and I feel like Shades doesn't quite feel completely the same way, but also doesn't want to hurt his friend. And it just, knowing later on what is likely to happen, because we know at that point already that Comanche's the snitch, if I'm not
right.
mistaken.
I think we do.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So knowing the way that is likely to shake out is just like that scene for me set up the tragedy of these two's relationship, and I feel like um some of it is just they were victims in many ways of societal pressures, because I'm
Hmm.
not even sure if Shades is. Uh, I'm not sure what to think about Shades' character. I'm never sure when he's genuine and when he isn't, except his interactions with Comanche. I felt like were always genuine.
Yeah.
Um, and that's really when he let his guard down and actually expressed what he was really feeling. Which is funny because he's in a romantic relationship with Mariah for a significant period in the beginning of the season through the middle, and toward the end, honestly. And I don't feel that same genuineness in his interactions with her until he starts talking with her about burning Anansi,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and I
Then
think
we
okay.
get the genuine Shades.
And well, and I actually even say, granted, I started by talking about him by shade about as shades, but I would say that I think so. You said this is not your wording; it's mine. But I would even say that I think what the conflict is there all along is Shades is in love with Mariah. Herman is in love with Comanche, and that
Mm,
so much of his plot line is about season one he is just full on Shades,
hmm
and season two Herman is starting to reemerge, and that Herman is much more tied to Comanche and not to Mariah, and that sort of some of his final conflicts with Mariah, he outright names that. And he says, you never really understood me the way he did, and you don't understand who I am and why this what you're doing bothers me so much. Um, and to me, it's very striking, especially in there's a scene towards the very end where Shades is confessing to all the crimes
mm,
that he did, and it now seems like he is 100% back to being Shades because he is joking. He's you know demonstrating no remorse at all. He's kind of enjoying the fact that he is getting to Misty Knight and like needling her with how he killed the witness and saying these things that upset them. And the first time I saw that scene, I thought this doesn't feel right. What happened to how much Shades had changed? The second time I watched it, what I was seeing was Herman desperately trying to put on the facade of Shades to stop feeling the guilt and sadness that he feels about Comanche's death and all the things that he's been involved with Mariah and all of that. And to me that just made it so much more heartbreaking to sort of see him, recognizing this facade that he's been putting on and now trying to put it back on because he just can't accept all the things that have happened.
absolutely. Absolutely. And you see that facade break when Comanche's mother walks into the interrogation room after he's after he's confessed to murdering Comanche,
Yeah.
right? And just seeing him go from that, cracking wise and being, kind of a jerk and talking through all of these horrible things that he's done as if they were, just like he'd put on a pair of socks and some shoes for the day. And then she comes in and it's just this break in his character.
Hmm.
Um, because yeah, I think you're absolutely right that that it was a facade he was putting on to try to sort of as a defense mechanism to try to protect himself from what's happening and what has become of his life. And then when he's confronted by Comanche's mother, he's confronted again by the horrific reality of what he's actually done, and he can't take it because he
Hmm.
killed his best friend.
Yeah.
And he
His
killed his
best
best
friend,
friend
his
for Mariah, who then went off the deep end and wasn't his way out of the life anymore the way he thought she was going to be.
right. Yeah. No, I think that's very true. His best friend, and I think important to name his lover because I
Mm-hmm.
think I think that Comanche is clear that he still has romantic. Comanche is clear that he is comfortable still having romantic feelings for Herman and wanting to act on them. I don't think that the idea is that Shades doesn't have those feelings. I think that Shades is conflicted and doesn't know if he has those feelings, and that
Mm.
just it again just adds one more level of complexity and beauty, I think, to the story in a real sad way.
It's tragic and it's it's another piece of media where we have this thing happening, but I feel like because they're not minor characters, we weren't introduced to these people like just this season. Um,
Hmm.
it gets a semi pass, but I can't say for sure if it gets a pass from that trope. That's not for me to name, right? But it's
Hmm.
still a case where Can we have more happy homosexual relationships in our media, please? I would be okay
That
with that.
that would be a very nice thing. And I think we're getting it in some other places in the MCU a little bit, but nowhere near enough. And yeah, it's the kind of thing where I feel like I didn't feel like that trope too much, but certainly I am not someone who's sensitive to it, and so my thinking it isn't necessarily a problem is a pretty worthless statement. And that certainly I think it would feel a lot better if we were getting more of the opposite of more gay couples that or bi or queer and any of that that did have happy endings. To the extent that I mean in the Netflix world, no one has a happy ending, but
Right,
but
right.
that
This is grim, dark superhero stories.
right, yeah, because certainly it did have some of that feel of that their gay relationship with each other was their downfall.
and
Um,
and it was their forbidden love, quote unquote, which is so
yeah,
that part of it I didn't like, and especially when Mariah's needling shades about it,
uh-huh,
uh, and throwing out such language as "gay for the stay,"
right,
um, and just yeah, God, that was horrid. And I feel like intentionally so. I feel like we were not supposed to that we weren't supposed to be laughing it up with Mariah in that moment. We were supposed to be like, oh, she's crossing another line. Uh,
right,
because this season really was a very now I'm talking about Mariah again, but she was like the most fascinating villain in the entire season. So
yeah,
but yeah, she the slow descent for her over time from the beginning of it where she's you know she's got a seemingly healthy stable relationship, she's trying to cut her criminal ties and go legitimate and just focus on her foundation and her political career and doing good for Harlem. And then at the end of the season, she's killed a bunch of people and dies herself.
yeah. No, it's very true. I think that kind of gives us a good place to wrap up. But is there any more that you wanted to get into, or any other points that we didn't get a chance to make?
So going back to the episode where where the Iron Fist shows up, there was something that Danny Rand commented on or said during his interactions with Luke when they're doing that thing where our heroes spar with each other so one of them can teach the other one some valuable philosophical lesson.
Uh
Uh,
huh.
which is, it's not sexy sparring, but it is also kind of a trope, but it's one that I kind of like, because in this
Right.
particular case, there's something that Danny sends about finding your center and being at peace, and that being so important to having clarity. That I feel like is a lesson that, again, from Danny Rand, a character that we have been rolling our eyes at and frustrated with up to this point. Here's something that he said that I was like, man, that's good. I
Yeah.
dig that, and maybe it's because I've studied a lot of disciplines that have that preach that kind of mentality. But for me, especially where Luke was, I felt like that's exactly what he needed to be doing. And I personally thought that whole exchange, the dialogue between the two of them, and then Danny trying to mentor Luke on anger problems when we know Danny, especially in season one, definitely had them himself, right?
Right.
And I've just started watching. I'm like 2 or 3 episodes into season two of Iron Fist. He still seems to have some anger issues, and I'm wondering if these seasons are contemporaneous with each other. We'll talk about it later, but
Hmm.
like I don't buy that mentor character out of what I'm seeing in these first couple of episodes of Iron Fist, even though this Danny Rand is better, and has clearly changed in how he wants to approach situations.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. And again, I don't want to get too much into it because I've seen things that you haven't yet. But I would just say I think you're right that I think to some extent I feel like it's a little bit hypocritical of Danny because he's still dealing with it, but it also feels Danny feels to me very much like the kind of character who would be good at you know the kind of like doctor take your own medicine idea of like
Mm,
he's very good at giving people advice that he doesn't follow.
yeah.
Um, I will say that I do think, as you said, he is becoming a better character in Iron Fist season two. I will also say that I think Iron Fist season two is a very good episode, very good season of television. I think he's probably the weakest character in the show still.
Sure.
but that part of what makes the show so good is how much it leans into some of the other characters. Um, and yeah, I think I don't really have anything else to add. I mean, there's so much more on some of these other topics we could go into. Um, I know we just briefly touched on the issue of Luke's father, um, but I think I never even thought of it. But you use the phrase Luke's father, and I can't but immediately think of Darth Vader, which
Yeah. Of course, yeah.
shouldn't have the claim on that for all characters named Luke. Um, but yeah, I think this is a good stopping point, and certainly I would say to all of our listeners, what did you all think? What's your take on Luke? I know certainly there has been a lot of debate over his final decision. Oh, actually, I will interrupt. There was one last point that I wanted to make that I'll admit I thought it was so interesting, and I wish we could explore it more because I have theories on what it could mean, but I think there's so much about what it could mean that I don't even know. But is Luke replacing the picture of Biggie Smalls, King Biggie, with the picture of Muhammad Ali?
Mm,
Because to me that's it's so much of Luke has always been very old school. He doesn't like rap and hip hop as much. He does somewhat, but he wants to sort of go back to the older generations, and Muhammad Ali certainly very much represents that. Muhammad Ali absolutely represents black pride and black power and black strength in ways that I feel are very tied to Luke Cage. Um, and I feel like I don't know enough about Ali and how he's positioned to comment on sort of what Ali means in terms of Luke Cage taking on that kingship role. But I just thought it was such a significant thing, and I hope that it's one that in whatever format we get back to Luke Cage, we certainly see commented on again.
yeah, I agree. I can't.
So
I also cannot comment on it because I
yeah,
don't know enough about the history.
yeah. So I'd say that's one more thing that if you want to talk to us about that, if you want to talk to us about any of this other stuff, you can tweet at us at Superhero Ethics. You can email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. But the best way to find us is to join our Facebook group. It's still small. We really are trying to grow it and to have that be a place to continue these conversations. So if you've got thoughts on these, I'm going to post some questions. I've not been good about doing that, but I want to get better at it. Post some questions for discussion. Chime in there. Tell us where you agree. Tell us where you think we were totally wrong. Tell us something a perspective that we don't have that should be part of this conversation. Please add that in. The other thing I would ask is if you like this podcast, you want more people to hear it, please leave us a review, especially on iTunes. If you can leave us a review, I hope it's a 5-star review, but leave whatever review you feel comfortable. The more of those reviews we get, it pushes us up higher on the search engine for iTunes and just gives more people a chance to hear us and to get part of this conversation. So thank you guys all for listening. Jacob, on behalf of myself and you, thanks everyone. And again, let me just close with a huge thank you to Stan Lee. Your life has touched so many of us, and your work is the basis of so much of the work we do. So we are sad at your passing, and so grateful for all you did. And so to Stan Lee, thank you. Excelsior.